Good afternoon.
Hello again, everybody.
We are here with Philip Howard, and this is part of our Fun Fact Friday. And this fun fact is really a personal fun fact. It is a story, really, rather than a fun fact. But it's about Philip's first ferry ride.
Right. Last week, I think it was last week, we talked about the mailboat Alita and coming over to Ocracoke on the Alita. And I was 6 years old when the last time I came there. That year, actually, I think it was that year, 1950, Frazier Peele from Hatteras decided to run a car ferry across Hatteras Inlet. And so my father decided that the next summer, when we came to Ocracoke, and many of you know that my father moved away from Ocracoke and moved to Philadelphia when he was real young, and then moved back later. But when we were living up in Philadelphia, he decided, I guess it was 1951, he decided that we were going to bring our 1948 Plymouth to Ocracoke by coming down Hatteras Island and coming across the inlet with Frazier Peele. And it was a 2-day trip from Philadelphia. First of all, there were 3 ferries that we had to take. The first one was across the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay before the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel was constructed. So that was, I think it was like an 85-minute trip across the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. And then we drove around Norfolk and turned to the Outer Banks. And we had to cross another ferry at Oregon Inlet. There wasn't any bridge there either. And my father knew that we were going to get there before the last ferry left. The ferry didn't run at night. It was a wooden ferry also, and I think it held about 12 cars.
You weren't going to get there before the last ferry left.
We weren't going to, did I misspeak? We weren't going to get there before the last ferry left. And my dad knew that we were going to have to sleep in our car that night. And we actually got there right about dusk. And my dad had made screens for our car windows. And as soon as we stopped, we put those screens in. It was not a minute too soon, because there was nothing there at the south end of Hatteras Island. No buildings or no motels or houses or anything down there. But there were swarms and swarms of hungry mosquitoes. And as soon as we put those screens in, we could hear the buzzing of all those mosquitoes outside the car trying to get to us. But we were safe. That was great. But it wasn't too long after we pulled up that we saw the lights from another vehicle come behind us, and we looked out the rear window, and it was a surplus World War II Army Jeep with 3 fishermen in it, and it didn't have any top. And as soon as they stopped, oh my God, the mosquitoes just attacked them. And they were beside themselves. They were yelling and hooting and hollering, jumping up and down and slapping all over. And it was just painful to listen to them trying to deal with those mosquitoes. And before too long, actually, we saw them running away. And we had no idea where they were going. There weren't any motels. There was no place for shelter. And we never heard them again for the rest of the night. But the next morning, when we were ready to board the ferry, they were back. And they were back at the Jeep. And the mosquitoes were gone. They weren't there in the morning. But my dad walked back and he said, "What did you all do last night with those mosquitoes? It had to be awful." They said, "Oh my God, that was the worst night of our entire lives." They said, we couldn't get away from them until finally we all waded out into Pamlico Sound until it was about 3 feet deep. And we just sat down in the water with the water up to our chins. And that was the only way we survived the night. And it lasted until about 1 o'clock in the morning, when there was a stiff breeze that blew the mosquitoes away, and we were able to get out of the water and get back to the Jeep. So anyway, we were glad we had screens in our car. We took that ferry across Oregon Inlet, and then there was another 70 couple miles to the south end of Hatteras Island, where Frazier Peele's boat was. And if you've taken a ferry to Ocracoke, I imagine that all of our listeners have, I always tell people just erase that vision of what a ferry boat is like. Frazier Peele's boat was in 1951, it was two shad boats that he had lashed together and nailed planking across the gunnels to create a decking. And it was big enough to hold a couple of cars. And we were the first ones on, and Frazier didn't have a ramp on that boat either. He just had two sturdy planks that he set the width of our car tires. And my dad drove up that ramp and onto the deck, and Frazier just moved the planks over for the second vehicle to get on. So there were two cars side by side like this. But there was a third car that wanted to come across, and Frazier put the planks just so that the last car could get the front tires up on the decking. And then all the men walked around to the back of the car and grabbed a hold of the rear bumper and picked it up and slid it 90 degrees, so that there were two cars this way and one like this. And we took off across the Sound, and about halfway across the inlet, about halfway across, the other drivers from the other two cars came over to visit with my dad. I think everybody knew each other. They were all from Ocracoke here. And they leaned up against our car, and I was just 6 or 7 years old sitting in the back seat, and the ferry listed over like this. I looked out this car window, and all I could see was water. I looked out this one, and all I could see was blue sky. I thought it was a great adventure.
And they had railings on that too, right?
I don't remember railings, but I saw a picture that had some very, very primitive railings.
Might have been only a few inches tall.
They were just wide apart and not much. But anyway, we made it across, and it was low tide. And I'll explain why it was low tide. But because it was low tide, Frazier couldn't get his ferry all the way up to the shoreline on the north end of Ocracoke. So he had to put those planks down about 100 feet off from the shore, something like that. And my dad backed our 48 Plymouth down into about 6 inches of salt water and turned it around and drove up onto the beach until all three cars were up on the beach. And the reason that it was low tide was we wanted to be able to drive to Ocracoke Village from the north end, and there wasn't any paved road on Ocracoke. So we would drive on the beach between low tide and the high water mark, which is where the sand was hard packed and you could drive a two-wheel drive vehicle. So once we got up on shore, the three drivers all talked about getting to the village, and they decided that if anybody got stuck on the beach, that the other two drivers wouldn't stop for them, because they didn't want three cars stuck on the beach. The goal was to get at least one car into the village, and if the other ones didn't show up, then they'd go alert the Coast Guard. They'd take their all-terrain vehicle down there and hopefully pull them out before the tide came in. So anyway, it's a 14-mile drive along the beach. But when we got about close to the village, somewhere between where today the National Park Service campground is and the edge of the village around where the variety store is, we had to go then from the beach across sand flats to the village. And in those days, it's hard to imagine if you've only been coming to Ocracoke for the last 40 or 50 years, but 75 years ago, there was nothing growing between the edge of the village, about where the variety store is today, to the National Park Service campground. That was a tidal flat called the Plains on Ocracoke. And it was just sand and shells and driftwood and a few tidal pools and maybe a couple tiny little dunes with some sea oats on them. But that was soft sand, and my dad was afraid he might get stuck because he didn't learn to drive on Ocracoke. He learned to drive even though he was born here, he didn't learn to drive here. So. And
this wasn't a four-wheel drive that he was driving?
No, it was a 48 Plymouth, just a two-wheel drive. We had slacked the air out of the tires, but still, my dad had made arrangements with his friend Ansley O'Neill to meet him out at the beach, and Ansley got into the driver's side. My dad sat in the center of the front seat, and Ansley put it in gear, and we were driving along the beach at that point, right along the surf, into first gear, second gear, finally third gear. And I don't know how fast we were going, but at least 40 miles an hour, maybe 50 or 60 miles an hour. At that point, he turned and went over that berm of the beach into that soft sand, and we plowed across the plains towards the village. And I was just astonished. All of a sudden, Ansley opened the car door, stood up, had his elbow out on the open car door. He was standing with his right hand on the steering wheel, looking out over the hood, because he wasn't able to, from where he was sitting in the car, he wasn't able to see the tidal pools or the driftwood or the pieces of debris that had washed up from shipwrecks and so forth. But standing up and looking over the hood of the car, he was able to see well. So he's driving with one hand on the steering wheel and his elbow on the open door. And my father's left foot was on the accelerator, pushing down as fast as he could go. So we were zigzagging across, kicking up sand and shells in the background. It was another great adventure for a 6 or 7 year old boy. But it didn't take long. We got across those sand flats to the edge of the village. There was a little hard-packed sand road. And we stopped. Ansley got out. My dad and Ansley visited just for a few minutes. And then my dad got back in, and we drove down into the village, down a little path right that you could see out that window if there weren't all those trees there, down to my grandmama's, who was in this house here. And she would have fried flounder and sweet potatoes and maybe some zucchini and some homemade light rolls for us. And all I can say is that that was the beginning of just a wonderful, magical time visiting Ocracoke in the early 1950s.
So it's a very different experience.
Very different experience.
Coming to the island today.
Just
but
one
still
more.
magical.
What's it?
Still magical.
It's
just
still
very
magical,
different.
but it was a different kind of magic then than it is today. But just one cautionary note. I looked on AI to see if it was a good idea to drive standing up with your arm on with the door open and your arm on the door while your passenger was operating the accelerator. And AI told me it was extremely dangerous and illegal. So don't try that at home, okay? Thank you all for joining us.